Good afternoon. This is Eric Smith, Director of Planning and Development of the Town of Athol. And it is Wednesday, April 22nd. Coincidentally, it happens to be Earth Day. And I think happy Earth Day, everybody. I think this is a great topic to be discussing on Earth Day. And today we're going to be presenting our Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Planning Program project, which has developed ultimately a set of action items in a document, a couple planning documents that will be presented today and available on our website. And just to give some background, last summer, the town of Athol, under kind of my direction, working with the town manager and the planning board, submitted a grant to the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs under their Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, or MVP for short. And we were able to get $53,000 in funding to the MVP plan. And our goal will be ultimately become an MVP certified community and apply for additional funding to implement some of the items you'll be learning about today. So after going through a process of potentially trying to select a consultant to work with, last fall, we selected BSC Group, and we have Jeff Malloy from BSC Group on the presentation today. We'll run you through the main presentation. We also have Dave Small, the chairman of the Board of Planning and Community Development with us, and Heather Bilucky Canning from the North Quabbin Community Coalition. We'll also be adding some additional details to the presentation. So at the very end, there will be an opportunity online for a survey. We want feedback, and through May 8th, I believe, or May 8th, Friday, May 8th, we'll be taking comments on the survey about your concerns on hazards, how they impact your life, and how you are be able to handle addressing preparedness for climate change here in the town of Athol. So at this point, I'll turn over to Jeff Malloy for the presentation.
Okay, great. Thanks, Eric. And let me see here. I am not seeing my presentation view. Yeah, I'm just seeing you, Eric. So I'm navigating the technological challenge here. So maybe I'll just pull us all up. Make sure I'm not on mute. Yeah, so thanks, Eric. Yeah, so as you said, Athol was awarded $53,000 from the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And the intent of this process was to put these funds towards achieving MVP climate community designation. What this does is it establishes eligibility for competitiveness for future grants that can be used to enhance the resiliency of the community to climate change. As part of this funding, we also undertook a hazard mitigation planning update process, which updated the hazard mitigation plan, which expires, I think, Eric, early next year. Is that correct?
I think it's May, May 2021.
Okay, yeah. So we got a really nice jump on updating the hazard mitigation plan. This is a really great opportunity to think proactively about the hazards that the community is experiencing as we're doing that hazard mitigation plan update. And again, this is an initiative of the MVP program as well. So, and additionally, which is a really exciting piece of this 10-month-long process that we've been involved in, is the development of a report that made climate justice or social justice a central feature of the MVP planning process. And so in addition to the findings report, which is the standard MVP process and the integrated hazard mitigation plan report that was prepared for this project, we also have a standalone, what we're calling the AHA 2020 report, which Heather is going to talk about a little later on in the presentation, which can be used either in conjunction with the MVP findings report or as a standalone document. So we're really excited about that, and we'll talk more about what that is as we proceed through this presentation. What you're seeing here is a graphic provided by the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. And what this graphic depicts is the framework that the state is using to build climate resilience within the Commonwealth. So you see three key features: climate mitigation, which again is taking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere; climate adaptation, which is adapting or building resilience to climate effects that we are going to experience as a result of climate change; and then hazard mitigation. And this is the hazard mitigation planning process that you would traditionally think about when you're doing hazard mitigation planning. But there's as you'll see through some of the action items that we identified through our MVP planning process over the last 10 months, there's many overlaps that exist. So it's a really nice framework that the state is using to think about preparing for the effects of climate change. And this map shows the communities in the state that have already gone through this process. So as you can see, I think approximately 80% of the communities throughout the state have undergone a planning grant process, which we are going through now and talking about today, but also an action grant process. So when you achieve your climate community designation, you become eligible for action grant funding. And this action grant funding allows you to implement some of the solutions that your community identified through the planning process. So many communities have gone through this. I know the state is looking to designate all the communities in the state as soon as possible. I'll also note, importantly, I've added our regional coordinator, Andrew Smith, his contact information on this slide. So if you have any specific MVP questions, I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. So what are the outcomes of this process? We mentioned some of them already. MVP community designation. Again, this makes you eligible for action grant funding. It also becomes a check mark on many other grant funding programs in the state. So it's a really important process to go through. So it's exciting Athol is nearing the end of their planning grant process. And it's a funding mechanism, as I just mentioned, and the grant eligibility and competitiveness in other grant programs. But importantly, you know, the public education and awareness piece has a big role in this process. It's a process that is organized around stakeholder engagement, and with our social justice, our equitable adaptation working group efforts that we did over the last year, you know, we did a great deal of engagement, which really led to an important in the development of a really important planning tool for the community to use as it thinks about its future climate adaptation planning. Again, climate resilience. This is why we're doing this. We're establishing climate resilience through this process. So, in climate justice, you know, we've mentioned many of these already. So, but you could see how, you know, you start to see overlapping themes that exist through the process. And more specifically, and I want to try to move this here. More specifically, I try to communicate this with all the communities that I would work with through a process such as this. You know, why is climate change planning important to your community? And there's two key points. Climate change gradually changes the distribution of risk. So we all think about risk in different ways. We apply risk in our daily lives, in basically everything we do. But climate change is changing the way we think about risk. And so, you know, the second piece of this is that climate change challenges the way that community resources are managed. And this is money, right? This is how we fund projects that are going to address, you know, the changes that we're experiencing due to climate change. So what have we been up to? We have undergone a series of core team risk assessments. So a group of individuals, stakeholders from the community got together on 5 or 6 instances over the last year where we went through the planning exercise. And integral to this piece was also the hazard mitigation planning aspect of the process where, you know, we took the hazard mitigation planning framework and applied it to the MVP planning framework, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And as I mentioned previously, we had equitable adaptation working group meetings. And this is where we thought about ways to make social justice a central feature of this planning process. And then we held a community resilience building workshop. So the photograph you see on this slide is a photograph of, you know, the community resilience building workshop that occurred in February. I think we had about 25 to 30 participants that that joined us that day for that exercise. So it was great. And then ultimately MVP designation is the goal. The photograph you see in the lower left-hand corner of this slide is an example of the framework that we used through the workshop. And I think a couple slides later, they'll show a little bit more detail of what that framework looks like. So this slide is just to recognize the core team working group. This is just some snips from the reports. Everyone that participated in the process has been recognized, acknowledged in the reports developed for this process. So yeah, thank you to everyone that participated. It was really great working with this community, and this is a diverse group of individuals that really brought some interesting perspectives to the process. And as I mentioned before, we met on a bunch of different times, and we learned a lot, so it was fun. And this is an example of the framework that's used. Basically, the whole MVP planning process is organized around this framework, which you could see the red box at the top of the screen is where you identify top priority hazards. This is the early planning that we did in the core team meetings. We identified the hazards that were that the community felt most important to think about as we go through as we apply actions to the vulnerabilities in the community. So when I say vulnerabilities, what does that mean? This is this yellow box that you see where these are basically categories: infrastructural, societal, and environmental categories that exist within the community. And stakeholders were asked to identify these various features within the community that can either serve as vulnerabilities or strengths. So, a floodplain can be both a vulnerable. So this would be an example would be an environmental feature, a floodplain. A floodplain is a vulnerability, particularly if there's development within the floodplain, but floodplains also serve as important values for flood mitigation. So as we thought about what are the important vulnerabilities and strengths in the community, and we compared them against the hazards that existed, we can then identify actions. And actions are which, you populate actions within the blue box that's shown on the framework here. So when I talked about hazards, the community felt that the 4 key hazards to think about were extreme temperatures. This can include both heat or cold, inland flooding, wind and microbursts, and extreme snow and ice events. And there were some examples. Some of these types of events were topical in people's minds when we were going through the planning effort. Because there were some really big wind and microburst events that occurred over the last year and a half within the region. So these events resonate with people in their mind, and so people felt very strongly and excited about coming up with actions to address these types of hazards.
And Jeff, actually, just one moment,
Sure.
back to the slide. We actually had that huge big wind event back in October during this planning process. Actually, that was pretty significant. A lot of power outages in the town of Athol and the surrounding areas as well, too. Right.
So, we're seeing these types of events, as we're going through the planning process. So it's really, so people were excited, like I said, to address these challenges. And so then when you identify which hazards you want to think about, you then think about categorizing community strengths and vulnerabilities. And as I mentioned before, we have infrastructural features and societal features and environmental features. And, typical infrastructural features are roads and bridges and buildings, and societal features are vulnerable populations that may exist within your community that are disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change. And then finally, environmental features. And we have a picture of a ice dam that Dave Small took, and it's provided in our planning report. And, ice jams are, that is a concern for the community. So, so it all just, it all fell into place really well. And ultimately, when we then took our hazards and compared them against the vulnerabilities or strengths within the community, and we were forced to identify actions to address these issues, we came up. We took all of the ideas and placed them into 4 themes. And the idea here is that there's many overlapping solutions that exist from one theme to another. So these are the four themes that we came up with: social vulnerability, the Millers River and downtown Athol, emergency preparedness, response and communication, and green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. So, for example, one key priority action item was redevelopment of downtown Athol and the adjacency of downtown Athol with the Millers River. People had a lot of interest to be connected to the river, but we also have socially vulnerable groups. Morton Meadows is a low-income and elderly housing facility that exists within a floodplain, and some of the solutions are building green infrastructure to address some of the urban heat island effect and flooding issues in this area. So, and again, that ties to emergency preparedness, response, and communication seamlessly. So you can see how this framework really starts to come together when you think about specific actions. And so I'll turn it over to Heather here to talk about some of the key items from our social vulnerability planning. And I'll mention again that the development of our AHA 2020 report ties closely to this.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. I just want to say that I'm very proud of the town of Athol really taking on looking at social vulnerability as a piece of this, because it is so crucial to how we look at economic justice and equity across our community. So basically, I get to do the fun job of talking to people who live here and hearing from folks that either consider themselves vulnerable or are vulnerable due to just numbers, population, and restraints that they may have in our community. So those included primarily parents of children, especially young children. We talked a lot with folks in the recovery community. We talked a lot for minority populations, many of which were small business owners here in our community. And our aging population. Athol is really known for folks being able to age in place and live very long lives here. So we want to make sure that across the board, people are really feeling included in decision making, and as well as really being taken into consideration when we're doing any planning for events that could throw off all of our lives. And I appreciate that Eric brought up that we actually started meeting as a group, as a core team, on the heels of a wind event that nobody had predicted. So I think it really gave us a lens to really look through as we did some of this planning, because that particular event, what we were lucky where it fell geographically in our town, because it really allowed the folks that were hit hardest were those who were economically a little bit better off than those if it had come right through our downtown strip. So it really gave us a lens to see where some of the disparities lay. We were able to do some one-on-one interviews and help folks really think through, what does preparedness look like? What are the things that you're nervous about? And what we found across the board is that our best asset here, which I think many of us knew, was the word of mouth and relationships that we have here, and how dependent folks are on their neighbors and family, whether that's blood or not, really checking in on each other and helping to provide for many of the things that keep people safe. So here we identified a bunch of the stuff that came up from those interviews. And we talked about a couple of populations that hadn't been identified before as particularly vulnerable. And we're seeing now just how important it is to look across the lifespan of folks' vulnerability. But teens and transition age youth are definitely more at risk for things like in being insured, being employed with living wage, meaningful employment, having consistent housing, those kinds of things. So that's just an example of what we were able to look at and what that means for folks' availability to prepare for the future. We were able to take our findings from this and really flesh them out at our workshop and put together the bones of the AHA plan. I will take no credit for the AHA name, but it is kind of catchy. And it helps us to really look at how we as a community can leverage those assets, which are our people, and support everyone across the board. So I would encourage you all greatly to take a look at that plan, consider it a working document, and put it into action.
All right, thanks, Heather. Yeah, that was a great overview of the social vulnerability piece that we, made, again, central to the planning process. It was a lot of fun pulling this AHA report together. So thank you. The second piece of our framework is Millers River and downtown Athol, and everyone feels really tied to downtown and to downtown Athol. Everyone spoke frequently throughout either the core team meetings or within the community workshop about how important it is to make sure that downtown Athol is an inviting place for the community, is a safe place for the community. People want to see green space in downtown. People talked about opportunities for green jobs in downtown Athol. Public shade trees, everyone likes public shade trees. Walkable downtown, just a place where you can recreate. So again, but you could see how many of these themes overlap with one another. So, and the connection to the Millers River is also, is important to everyone. The Millers River flows right through downtown Athol. And so people want to feel that connection to the river. The next piece is emergency management and preparedness. And the community feels very strongly about the fact that they have an emergency management and preparedness system that works, and it has worked in the past, but they also acknowledge that there's always opportunity to improve upon the systems that they have in place. And as Heather spoke about a few minutes ago, it's that social connectivity within the community that is so incredibly important. So people talked a great deal about finding new ways for people to communicate with one another and create social networks. Emergency management and preparedness isn't just about, police and fire responding to a hazard or an emergency. It's the community being able to communicate with each other and form these social networks, which increases their social capital overall throughout the community. And finally, green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. And, the bullet points you see on this slide are some of the same bullet points that we've been talking about over the last few minutes. So, it's apparent. Again, I speak about these co-benefits or these overlaps, but this is what it's all about. And I'll specifically mention Silver Lake and Lake Ellis. People, urban heat island effect is a concern within the community, and people talked about having these lakes as areas to cool themselves down when during an extreme heat event. And the water quality of these lakes are incredibly important. So again, we see many of the same themes.
And Jeff, if I could just interject quickly about Lake Ellis. We're actually undertaking a Lake Ellis water quality watershed planning project right now at this point in time. We actually had a public kickoff meeting. It's very well attended. A lot of people from Lake Ellis. That was on March 10th. And moving forward, we'll have more communication with the public, but we're in the COVID-19 time period. That's why we're doing this online presentation today. But the community will see more about Lake Ellis planning in the upcoming year.
And I will turn this slide over to Dave to talk for a few minutes about some of the opportunities for co-benefits within downtown Athol.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. This has been a great process, and we've heard from a lot of people. But, for the last 20 years or more, I've been involved with various groups in town, from the Watershed Council to the Environmental Center to the Conservation Commission. And we have a shade tree commission that gives free trees to local citizens every year to put street side to help beautify the area. So the town has a long commitment to really doing some greening of the town, and very aware of the whole river and its pluses and minuses. And when you look at the heat map here we're looking at now, I mean, it just goes to show you that that area in the center of downtown where Lord Pond Plaza is and the main street and the main intersections, it really could use some work. And we have a Mill Brook that runs through the parking lot of Ocean State Job Lot and the Senior Center. That whole place has got like 5 entrances for cars and no traffic pattern, and it really is it has a lot of problems. And when we look at this whole plan, over and over and over again, we heard from various residents that this is something we really ought to do something about. And it really brings together the whole idea of the greening of the green solutions, perhaps daylighting the brook and planting trees in that downtown area, and reducing the amount of pavement, and working with stormwater abatement and making sure that we have good infiltration, and really reviving the brook and the wildlife that goes with it, and just some really great opportunities. And we certainly looked at not far away is Morton Meadows that we've talked about earlier, as something that really doesn't belong in the floodplain. Every time we have an event on the river, the first place we evacuate is Morton Meadows, and it's a real hazard to the residents of that area and to the emergency personnel that have to deal with that. So it was really really uplifting to me to see all the things come together to look at a project in our downtown that really may make a huge difference to the walkability, to the social interactions downtown, making it safer for both pedestrians and drivers, and help quell the heat effect that we have there. Anyway, it's very exciting to hear so many positive exchanges about this is where we really like to focus some attention. And I think moving forward, it's probably going to be our first action item, I think, is to do some feasibility on this and to see just where we're going to go in the future. But I did see a lot of public support, and having conversations with various citizens around town unofficially. I think this will be a great project moving forward.
Thanks, Dave. And so just to dig in a little bit, we collected many action items within that framework that I discussed earlier. We identified hazards, and then we identified categories within the community of infrastructural, societal, and environmental features. And then we took that kind of bingo board, right? And we developed actions that addressed those vulnerabilities or strengths against the hazards. And the list of actions gets very large. And by creating this framework, we can look at co-benefits. We can really start lumping projects together. So at the end of the workshop process, we did a in-person survey. Raise your hand. What do you vote for? And these are some of the top projects that emerged out of that vote at the end of the day when we had our workshop. So Dave just spoke about Lord Pond Plaza, and Heather talked about implementing the AHA 2020 Athol Helping Athol community plan for social resilience. As Heather said, let's use that plan. It's a living document, a working document. Let's implement it. Some of the other things people talked about were green jobs programs and downtown nature-based solutions, urban heat island mitigation. Again, this overlaps with the Lord Pond Plaza issues at Lord Pond Plaza. community networks and engagement and education. This is all about building that social resilience within the community. There's an aging housing stock within the community, and many people talked about if we're going to renovate this aging housing stock, let's renovate with renewable energy that can make people more economically resilient to these challenges. Recreational open space, Athol lakes and water quality. Eric spoke about some of the efforts currently occurring to address water quality within Silver Lake and Lake Ellis. So many of these things are already happening in one way or another, and it's on people's radar now. So it's just a really good outcome from this project. So just a few thank yous as we wrap up this presentation. Eric, it's been great to work with you through this process, and I've had a lot of fun in doing this planning initiative. And the core team members, you know, always had a really great, thank you to everyone that was on the core team. I had a great time working with you all. I learned a lot. And workshop participants, we had a great group that day. Everyone was really engaged through the whole day. So that was a lot of fun. And Heather, you know, I just want to give you a special thank you. You had gone above and beyond in making sure that this Athol plan really came together. And you did a bunch of interviews with people in the community, you know, and it's about that trust piece. You know, people trusted you, you know, to speak with you. So that was just really great. And we couldn't have done that without your help. And then lastly, we're asking the community to stay engaged. So Eric has, on the planning website, has developed the Athol's planning department website has created a MVP page specific to the products that have been developed to date, the plans and the reports. And so you could see links to all of them there. And we've also developed a survey. So anyone who hasn't been engaged in the process to date, you know, please feel free to go in and take the survey. And we're going to make that live through Friday, May 8th. So it's a couple weeks to take that survey, and we're gonna take what we learned from the survey and we're gonna drop it right into the findings report. So yes, I encourage everyone to check out these reports, and that's about it for the presentation. Unless Eric, you have anything you'd like to say in closing?
Again, thanks for your help, Jeff. I mean, it has been a
course.
pleasure to work with you, and you know, your guidance, your facilitation along the way. Thanks to your BSC group colleagues who, you know, helped facilitate the large group, you know, with the breakout sessions at the February workshop. You know, the draft plans, both the full summary of findings document that's now up on the planning department's website. How report, which is like I said, the standalone document, that's up on the website, as well as a survey. I'm going to be working with the Daily News and AOTV, help promote this effort as well further. And, you know, we want as much feedback as possible in the next, you know, 2 weeks plus.
Great. So I am going to stop this share here. And unless anyone else has anything they'd like to add, I'm going to stop recording. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
And let me
Thank
stop
you.
this here.